George Armstrong Custer, arguably one of the most flamboyant and iconic generals in American history, was a distinguished Civil War officer whose legacy was irrevocably tarnished after he led over 200 troops belonging to the United States 7th Cavalry, including himself, to their deaths at the Battle of Little Bighorn. In truth, Custer's biography reads much like a classic Hollywood screenplay, full of old-school cinematic tropes. An unlikely hero, he was born into poverty, overcame all odds and attended West Point, led his country to victory during the Civil War, yet tragically perished in the Indian Wars. Unsurprisingly, Custer's inherently fascinating life and military exploits have canonized him in American pop culture, and his likeness has been featured in dozens of paintings, films, and literature over the years. One of the most prominent cultural depictions of Custer, the 1941 Western film They Died with Their Boots On, achieved notoriety among critics for its gross historical inaccuracy and pro-Custer slant. The film befittingly stars the flamboyant, iconic Errol Flynn as Custer, yet greatly distorts, and in some cases completely whitewashes, historical fact to shape the narrative in a way that is congruous with the standard cinematic conventions of entertainment during Hollywood's golden age. In doing so, the film serves as a propaganda piece, portraying Custer as more honorable and heroic than history remembers him. The film opens with Custer's arrival at West Point in 1857. He pompously gallops up to the gate on horseback, underscored by the sonorous boom of trumpets. His clothes resemble those of a hussar, and his hat is adorned with feathers. His appearance starkly contrasts his fellow cadets, who are all dressed in simple, working-class attire. The sergeant on duty speculates that Custer must be a foreigner, or, better yet, a brigadier general, intended as a subtle foreshadow. This ostentatious entrance is the film's first of many misrepresentations of the real-life George Custer, seen in his West Point uniform here. Custer hailed from an undistinguished family. He spent most of his boyhood living in poverty in Monroe, Michigan, with his stepsister and brother-in-law. Custer was far too poor to afford the ornate garments his character dons in this scene. However, the director's costuming choice is intentional. He disregards historical fact to depict Custer as proud and stately, drawing a clear division between Custer and the other cadets, who resent his gaudy arrival. This feeds into the aforementioned classic Hollywood narrative and conventions of entertainment, and not only does it enhance Custer's image as a hero, as propaganda does, it establishes dramatic conflict between Custer and his classmates. That conflict comes to fruition in the film's next scene. Custer gets into a brawl during his first inspection with an upperclassman named Ned Sharp, who pranked him earlier. Custer is rushed before the superintendent, Philip Sheridan, who forgives Custer for his insubordination, noting he sees something special in the boy. The film then ironically cuts to a montage of Custer amassing countless demerits, ranging from additional physical altercations to tardiness at breakfast. This is, of course, somewhat historically accurate, as Custer did amass a record number of demerits during his career at West Point. Despite his poor academic performance, Custer still graduates early, following the outbreak of Civil War, and is transferred to Washington. Once in Washington, Custer has a chance encounter with General Winfield Scott at a restaurant and lunches with him. The men banter, and Scott, much like Sheridan, takes an immediate liking to Custer. Scott secures Custer an appointment to the 2nd Cavalry Regiment on the eve of the Battle of Bull Run. Custer, despite only holding the rank of lieutenant, defiantly takes charge of the regiment during battle, delivering orders and asserting his militaristic superiority over his commanders. He is wounded in the course of the fight, which earns him a medal for bravery, even though he blatantly defied his commanders. While on leave recovering from his wounds, Custer travels home to Monroe and patronizes a local saloon, where he first hears the song Gary Owen, a famous Irish melody that becomes an important motif in the film, which will embody Custer's heroism. Custer receives a letter soon after his return to the 2nd Cavalry, which promotes him to Brigadier General, just days prior to the Battle of Gettysburg. Now a high-ranking commander, Custer has a string of military triumphs, beginning with his defeat of Confederate General Jeb Stuart. This impresses his superiors. The film transitions into a montage of Custer's victories, with the names of battles, Monterey Gap, Yellow Tavern, Woodstock, Winchester, and Cedar Creek flashing on screen, inundating the viewer with a heroic perception of Custer, to say the least. The montage, however, glosses over Custer's failures, most notably his defeat at the Battle of Trevilian Station, the bloodiest battle of the war. Custer had attempted to capture General Wade Hampton's supply train before he was ultimately cornered by Confederate troops, forcing the Union, under the command of General Sheridan, to retreat after sustaining heavy casualties. This battle was omitted from the montage as it was an embarrassing loss for Custer, making him appear reckless and short-sighted rather than honorable and heroic, as the filmmaker would have his audience believe. Finally, the war ends, and Custer returns to Monroe, where he is given a hero's welcome by the entire town. Custer, however, soon grows weary of the tedium of domestic life outside the army, which prompts him to start drinking. In truth, Custer never drank. During his youth, he promised his stepsister he would abstain from alcohol at all costs. This mischaracterization gives Custer the opportunity for redemption, a hackneyed Hollywood plot device that appeals to the common moviegoer. Redemption comes when General Scott selects the deadbeat, shall we say, Custer, to lead the U.S. 7th Cavalry. Custer, eager to return to service, assembles his cavalry and departs for Fort Lincoln to participate in the Indian Wars. Not long after they arrive, two recruits begin to brawl near the fort's canteen. Custer demands the men be arrested for misconduct. This demand would have been completely incongruous with Custer's character. In fact, he once received a demerit at West Point for failing to intervene in a fistfight between cadets, allegedly exclaiming, "Let's have a fair fight." This serves as yet another example of the filmmaker misrepresenting Custer for polemic purposes. Custer appears noble and righteous for reprimanding the recruits. The filmmaker expands upon this characterization by then having Custer discipline the rest of his cavalry by leading them in a rousing rendition of Gary Owen, which becomes their regimental march. Next, another montage occurs, highlighting the 7th Cavalry's battles against the Sioux and Cheyenne peoples. This epitomizes the concept of manifest destiny. These battles were fought to expel natives from the plains so that they could be settled by white men. The montage flows seamlessly into a scene between Chief Crazy Horse of the Sioux and General Custer. Crazy Horse says his people will concede all of their land except the sacred Black Hills, where spirits of their ancestors dwell. Custer responds, and I am not making this up, by reassuring Crazy Horse that, assuming his superiors grant permission, the 7th Cavalry will defend the Indians' rights to the Black Hills. Now, unbeknownst to Custer, a group of crooked businessmen, led by none other than his West Point rival, antagonist Ned Sharp, have plans to spread news of gold in the region, which will fracture Sioux relations. This is perhaps the most flagrant whitewashing of history in the entire film. Custer himself led the expedition that discovered gold in the Black Hills, and he personally exaggerated his findings to prompt a gold rush in the area. Custer's role in the gold rush is altogether neglected in this film. The property rights of the Sioux were clearly of no concern to the real-life Custer, so in an effort to glorify him as more noble, the filmmaker takes extreme dramatic license and essentially rewrites history to portray Custer as an advocate for the Indians. This is more appropriate for the classic Hollywood narrative. Audiences desire a character for which they can root. Custer travels to Washington to fight on behalf of the Sioux, but his efforts are in vain. The gold rush, started by Ned Sharp, has caused the Sioux to become hostile, and the government has already ordered troops led by Generals George Crook and Alfred Terry into the Black Hills. Custer, after being derided by Congress, has no choice but to return to his cavalry in the Dakota Territory and prepare to take up arms himself. Upon his return to camp, Custer is informed that General Crook's infantry has already been wiped out by Crazy Horse, who is now poised to take on General Terry's main force. Custer, no doubt thirsty for glory, decides that he must intervene and prevent Crazy Horse from slaughtering Terry's unit. Custer leads his cavalry to the Little Bighorn River. The camera pans to reveal several Indian scouts spying on Custer from atop a hill. Suddenly, the film's score crescendos as Custer notices a corpse ahead of him, followed immediately by an ambush of Sioux warriors, springing the cavalry into action. The exposition to the battle is exceedingly dramatized. In reality, Custer attempted to ambush a sleeping Sioux village. Crazy Horse would later claim the attack was a surprise and totally unlooked for. But by portraying Custer as vulnerable and unsuspecting, the film's conflict is only heightened, playing into the trite Hollywood structure. Thus begins the Battle of Little Bighorn, also known as Custer's Last Stand. The camera cuts between the two opposing forces, each underscored by music that alternates between traditional Native American themes and, you guessed it, Gary Owen, depending on which group is on screen. Take a listen. Now, as you can hear, the blaring bugles give Gary Owen a more exuberant tone than the ominous tribal melody, which helps portray the natives as savages and Custer as heroic, which is the film's primary goal. Once the dust settles, Custer is, by divine providence, the last white man left standing, his golden locks blowing in the wind. According to White Bull, a warrior who fought under Crazy Horse, Custer had shaved his trademark hair and mustache in preparation for the battle, but the filmmaker ignores this fact to have Custer appear more regal in his final moments on screen. Crazy Horse, betrayed by Custer, delivers the gunshot that ends the general's life in a cinematic moment of poetic justice. Custer melodramatically grabs his chest and falls to the ground as Sioux warriors ride past his body, and the scene gradually fades to black. There is no recorded evidence to suggest Crazy Horse was the one who delivered the final blow that ended Custer's life. In fact, the identity of Custer's killer is still a topic of debate among historians even today, and Custer was certainly not the last man left standing. Nearly half of the 655 men who rode with Custer on that fateful day survived the encounter. The film's depiction of the battle is but a spectacle. Details are embellished to produce a more thrilling, more satisfying climax for the audience, one that fits into the classic Hollywood story arc. Custer sacrifices his own life and his cavalry to save General Terry's regiment and bring honor to his country, a fitting end to a film that spends much of its 2.5-hour runtime glorifying Custer's war record and manipulating history to portray him as a benevolent hero. This not only helps the story adhere to the Golden Age's standard conventions of entertainment, more importantly, it serves to maintain Custer's international reputation, which was severely tainted after his defeat at Little Bighorn. The film, while heartily entertaining, is still propaganda, and therefore it distorts historical fact to paint a more respectable picture of a disgraced general, George Armstrong Custer.